lunch because we can't have anybody nodding off. There's such interesting presentations to come. And you know, I'm living in Switzerland now, so I'm very conscious of the clock. And you know what? It's exactly the right time, 14:10. Isn't that great? We've managed to catch up and everybody is here. My name is Colin Archer. I'm the Secretary General of the International Peace Bureau based in Geneva. Great pleasure to be here in this city at this time with this special community of people with such a lot of expertise in the room. I grew up in a safe place at a safe time. It was suburban London in the 1950s. Rationing had just finished. And I think somehow that's given me an image of what a peaceful place can be. But as I grew up, and certainly as I got involved in peace questions, I began to see that for many people in the world at another time and in another place, it was far from safe, and that cities were vulnerable places. So I can relate to the title of this conference. Somehow I got involved in peace issues, and you know, I had in the back of my mind that my parents' stories about the Blitz in London, the bombing of London in the war. And I visited America and found out about the secret bombing of Cambodia and Laos. This was in 1972. I also heard about family stories, and as I was planning this visit, I was reminded by my brother that we have a great uncle who is buried in the cemetery in Kortrijk just down the road. And actually he died on the 25th of April 1918, so it's almost exactly the right day of the year to go and visit. So all these things fed into my peace engagement. I won't give you the whole story, but being active with the campaign for nuclear disarmament during some of the high period of the 1980s was pretty exciting. Anyway, I was asked to come to Geneva in 1990, just at the hinge of history, you know, when everything was changing. And some people thought it was going to be a peaceful period, but it's been far from that. Especially if you live in Rwanda, or you live in Bosnia, or Sri Lanka, or any number of these places where conventional war goes on. The International Peace Bureau has a long history of working for nuclear abolition, but in recent years we've focused much more on the economic dimension of warfare. We have a campaign called the Global Campaign on Military Spending, which is part of a broader program called Disarmament for Development. And just for your calendars, we're going to have a major gathering in Berlin next year, at the end of September, to bring these issues into the forefront of public debate, the need for economic transformation, which is about moving from a war economy to a peace economy. Many big challenges. We have another project, which I just mentioned before I introduce the speakers, and that is a major photographic exhibition called Making Peace. You have the Dutch language brochure here. It's on show in Ypres now. The official opening is on Saturday. If you can't stay till Saturday, you can see it. If you have a spare hour, go to the ramparts just next to the Menin Gate. It's over 100 panels of top photojournalism and very stimulating ideas there for a broad perspective on peacemaking the last 100 years. So that's some of the things we're involved in, and we'd be delighted to work with any of you on any of these aspects. So we have three really good speakers this afternoon. I regret we don't have any ladies, but you know, gender balance is perhaps something to be seen within the frame of the whole conference rather than this particular session. Paul Walker, the director of the Green Cross International's Environmental Security and Sustainability Program. He's really one of the experts on chemical weapons, and I believe he's going to be talking particularly about the destruction of chemical weapons, which is a topic we haven't yet addressed. He's also manager of the Washington office for the Green Cross International and its national affiliate in the US, Global Green USA. But he doesn't just know about chemical weapons. Paul is a former professional staff member of the Armed Services Committee in the House of Representatives, so he knows the political world very well. He's also done a PhD in security studies and is a Vietnam-era Army veteran, so he knows about the war system as well. Paul has worked, spoken and published very widely in many different areas relating to these topics, and he took part in the first on-site inspection by US officials of the Russian chemical weapons stockpile in '94. Paul, the floor is yours.
So, computer. Hi, everybody. I'm just waiting for my computer here. Oh, William's computer, I should say.
Yeah, it's holding up.
It's holding up. I'll just take good care of it here so it doesn't crash down.
There's the table.
There we go. Yep. Yep. So I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you, all the organizers. I know to the Ypres administration, the Mayors of Peace, Aaron, and others, and certainly Matthias and William, who helped me, I know, quite a bit to get here. I'm a couple hours late because our train was, well, I should say my wife and I misidentified the train in Kortrijk, as those of you who've taken the train to Ypres, and we got on the back of the train rather than the front of the train. It's the first time I've ever seen a train split in half. So when the conductor came around, he said, your ticket says you're going to Ypres, but you're going to France. And I said, well, just maybe France would be nice too, who knows? So we wound up in Lille, Flanders in France, and then we just stayed on the train. We turned right back to Kortrijk, and then we figured out that we had to get on platform 4B, not 4A. And I said to the conductor, you should really tell people this before they get on the train, because there was no way of identifying which part of the train was going where. He said, it's all announced ahead of time. And I said, well, but it's announced in Flemish. I said, those of us who are a little more globalized, we could deal with the French or the German or the English or maybe even Russian, but not Flemish. So anyway, I don't want to be too critical of Flemish. So I'm going to talk a bit. I know you've already had some wonderful speakers. Jean-Pascal has talked about this. I've just come from Berlin. Debbie and I were, my wife, Debbie, is right here with me too. My wife and I were 2.5 days at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, the Fritz Haber Institute. And those of you who know chemical warfare history, Fritz Haber was one of the big German developers of chemical weapons. To the credit of Fritz Haber Institute and Max Planck Institute, they did a big 2-day symposium on the history of chemical warfare, history of development, and how the Germans got there, but the French and Americans and the Russians and all the rest. So it was actually a very, very interesting history. So I'm steeped up to about here in World War I history right now. So I'm going to skip, I know you've had this presentations already. I'm going to skip really from World War I up to the present, more or less, the last 25 years. Let's see if I'm ready. Here we go. And really try to emphasize, I think, for you, the challenges we've had in trying to abolish chemical weapons, and then draw some lessons from that on what that might mean for nuclear and biological weapons, or frankly, any other weapon systems. You've all seen this picture, the famous picture, of course, of the troops in World War I, Allied forces blinded or partially blinded or temporarily blinded and trying to make their way. I mean, probably been hit by mustard weapons. I think not the chlorine of Ypres fame. But of course, you've probably heard this before. We're 100 years and a day beyond the German attack with chlorine. But the point I try to make is not only was the German attack, of course, horrible and really shocking to everybody, but in fact, everyone else went forward then and started their own development program and weaponized much worse things than chlorine. So eventually we soon saw mustard and phosgene and lewisite and other nasty chemical agents. So overall 90,000 are judged to be killed. There's a whole very esoteric debate on the exact numbers killed in any of these wars, but particularly around chemical weapons in World War I. So 90,000 is a rough figure used, but I've heard arguments that it's been anywhere from 6,000 up to 150,000. So I use generally the estimate of 90,000 and 1 million injured, but nobody frankly knows the exact number as far as I know. Geneva Protocol, I think John Pascal, you probably talked about that, right? So I'm not going to say much about that. The big point here is it was great, it was done. I think it was predictable as a result of World War I, but it didn't ban the research, development, test, evaluation, and production and stockpiling of chemical weapons. It banned the use of chemical weapons. And at the bottom of the slide here, you'll see President Roosevelt, some years later in 1943, in World War II, said use of such gas weapons has been outlawed by the general opinion of civilized mankind. What he didn't say is the United States refused to, of course, ratify the treaty at that point. So it was in the 70s, I think, we finally ratified the Geneva Protocol with a number of stipulations, of course, like most of the countries. But to bring you up to the current point, you know, fortunately, chemical weapons were not so much used in World War II, yet the case of the Japanese, to some extent, using it against the Chinese. And today we all work on, you know, the excavation of all the hundreds of thousands of Japanese old buried chemical weapons left in China. And that's a big issue. If I know some of you from the OPCW are well aware of this, but the two countries that really go at it every annual meeting of the Chemical Weapons Convention are the Chinese and the Japanese, for a whole number of reasons, but primarily around buried chemical weapons, which Japan is gradually, steadily, you know, excavating. And I know Japan has spent billions of dollars so far on this, and China, of course, keeps arguing that they don't spend enough. The only other instance, besides these you see on the screen, was really the Egyptian use of chemical weapons in the Yemeni War in 1963. So you have some use in World War II, but not by any of the, you know, the major powers on the European fronts. You have some minor use by Egypt in the Yemeni War, I think, and then, of course, the big reuse of chemical weapons since World War I was in the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. And then particularly in 1988, the attack on Halabja and a number of the Kurdish communities. And I know we have the mayor of Halabja here, so I'm delighted to have you here as well. We've had the mayor from Halabja also speaking in The Hague several times, except for the one year he was excluded by the Chinese ambassador specifically. When I asked the Chinese ambassador why he wouldn't allow the mayor to come and speak in The Hague on victims of chemical warfare, he said because he's a member of Mayors for Peace. And I said, well, what does that have to do with chemical weapons in The Hague? And he said, because Mayors of Peace has mayors from Taiwan in its membership. And so you can see the politics of this whole area, sometimes having absolutely nothing to do with the Chemical Weapons Convention or with the chemical weapons themselves, sort of enters in. And we've had, I won't go into all the other cases, but there have been other cases with other countries you could all probably readily think of. 91 Gulf War, Saddam Hussein had chemical weapons. They were all largely destroyed by the United States and Allied forces when they pushed everyone out of Kuwait and bombed a lot of the weapons depots. All those weapons, the leftover weapons from Saddam Hussein's chemical weapons stockpile, which he had used in the Iran-Iraq War and against the Kurds, were packaged up and dumped in two big bunkers by United Nations inspectors in 1990. And that's one of the issues we're dealing with today in Iraq. How we access these old, enormous bunkers, the size of a soccer field, 3 stories high, you know, filled, sealed in concrete and steel rebar. 95 Tokyo attack, I think probably people mentioned this too, you know, was important in the sense that it showed terrorists were after chemical weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, biological weapons in this particular case too, but that they really weren't quite able to deploy it in a very effective way. So you had sarin deployed in the Tokyo subway by the Aum Shinrikyo. They took 4 little plastic sandwich bags and poured homemade sarin into it, which was quite deadly. But they just punctured the bags and dropped them on the floor of 4 subway cars. And as the sarin evaporated over time, and people stepped in it and all, in the end, about 12 to 13 people were killed, but 5,000 people were injured in the panic that set in. So it showed that unless you deploy a deadly agent like sarin really effectively, you're not actually going to be effectively killing a lot of people, but you can potentially injure and cause panic and terrorize people very well. Ongoing threats, you'll see here in the next last bullet, continually was mentioned by Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and now we see what's happening in Syria, of course, from 2012 to the present, and also in the ISIS insurgent group. So let me move on. Just say the Chemical Weapons Convention, to me, is really one of the really good news stories of the last 3 decades. It was a long time coming. You know, it originated way back. People go back to the 19th century and the Hague Accords back in the late 19th century. But to me, it really originated in the Geneva Protocol, but then also the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union in the late 70s, early 80s, really identified chemical weapons as no longer militarily useful. Sure, terror weapons, but the enormous stockpiles that the Americans and the Russians in particular, but also other countries, many other countries that stockpiled, had become really burdensome, expensive, dangerous, leaking, really worried, increasingly so about accidents in particular, not particularly terrorist attack in the 1980s. And so, as you may know, the Americans and the Russians agreed together in the late 80s, bilaterally, that they would destroy their stockpiles. So years before the Chemical Weapons Convention ever was open for signature, the Americans and the Russians had agreed to go forward unilaterally and reciprocally in destroying their stockpiles. The United States began its stockpile destruction in 1990. It began building the facility long before then. But the first facility for U.S. unilateral destruction was in 1990 on Johnson Atoll. Both Russia and the United States ratified in 97. Fortunately, the United States before entry into force just 2 or 3 days in April, late April. And that was a big fight in Washington, D.C. that we in Washington were very engaged in. And we finally convinced, the Clinton administration, kicking and screaming, to come in and mount a campaign for the last 6 months where we could do some vote counting in the Senate to make sure we had 67 votes, 2/3 majority. 190 states parties today, maybe 191, depending on how you count Myanmar, but I'll come back to that. 6 countries still outside the treaty I'll come to in a minute, and then 8 countries have declared chemical weapons stockpiles. So out of 190 countries, only 8 have declared stockpiles. That's pretty good. The real problem was 2 of them were enormous, the Russian and the American. So here are the stockpiles. The big one, the Russian, 40,000 metric tons in 7 big sites. The Americans, 28,600 metric tons, or 31,500 US tons, as we like to say in the United States, in 9 stockpiles. India with about 1,000 tons, and South Korea with about 1,000 tons. I don't know the exact numbers. I know some people here do, because they've probably seen the classified information. I haven't, and I'm glad I haven't, because now I can talk very naively about it all. But it's in that range. Libya, 26 metric tons. Albania, 16 metric tons. Iraq, we don't know, these 2 bunkers that are left in Iraq. In Syria, 1,308 metric tons, although that's varied about 20 or 30 tons back and forth over the last year that we can talk about later if you'd like. Let me bring you up to date on destruction. We've worked the destruction process very closely. We, meaning Green Cross, myself, and other colleagues in the United States. And we've also worked the destruction process in Russia very closely. I'm probably one of the very few people who's been to every single site and gone into the stockpiles themselves. And as Colin mentioned, to begin with, in 1994, when I worked on the Armed Services Committee, the military committee in the U.S. House of Representatives, I was either fortunate or unfortunate, however you look at it, to actually organize and do the first American on-site inspection of a Russian stockpile in July 1994. And that was actually quite an amazing point in my life and my career, and is really what's brought me to the point where I spent the last 20 odd years really focused on abolition of abolition of chemical weapons. Because I realized in 1994, after marching into this, walking into this enormously dangerous, remote stockpile of the Russians with 5,400 tons of nerve agent in 2 million artillery shells and 1,000 broad and scud missile wagons, with almost no security on the site, within spitting distance of Kazakhstan. Throw a baseball across the border in Kazakhstan. This was right before, a year before Aum Shinrikyo and the terrorist assault in Tokyo. So we didn't quite know about the seriousness of the terrorist threat at that point. But we were shocked. No inventory, almost no security. Little 16-year-old armed guard, unpaid at the front gate. Little jeep, they rode around the perimeter once a day to check on whether any animals had broken in or anything. Little chain link fence, barn doors with bicycle padlocks on the front door that were shaken back and forth, broken windows, holes in the roof. And yet, I'll show you a picture later of the stockpile. Just shocking. So we're happy to move forward. In the United States, it really has been a very successful program. I mean, those of us very involved could spend hours talking about all the challenges and the difficulties and all the personalities and the biases between different disciplines, thermal engineers versus wet chemists and things of that nature. But in the end, we've destroyed 90% of the stockpile so far. A big step forward, 25,650 tons, give or take 50 tons. Seven of the 9 stockpiles closed now, finished. There's still some cleanup going on and decontamination and all. The big issue, of course, is $35 billion spent in the United States. It's one of the biggest historic procurement programs in the history of the United States military. It's only probably surpassed by major weapon systems and nuclear weapon systems in particular. We still have 8 years to go. Hopefully less, but I think the conservative estimate is we'll finish around 2023. Something like that. The original deadline for U.S. destruction was 1994. So we'll be in the end close to 30 years delayed. Only 30 years. So think about that in the Syrian case, where we're worried about months of delay in Syria. I thought, month? I mean, we've been waiting 3 decades in the United States, so. And in the Russian case, they've done pretty well. I mean, I went there in 1994. They had agreed in the late 80s to destroy their stockpile. Unilaterally and reciprocally with the United States. But they really didn't get going to be serious about it until 2002. We were very worried in 1994 about security on the Shuchi site. Any one of these 2 million artillery shells could have disappeared at any point. And in 9/1, after we wrote a classified memo in 1994 to the U.S. Secretary of Defense and recommended that we work immediately to get high security on the Shuchi site and also on its sister site, the comparable site, which is a site called Kizil in the Udmurt Republic, which is still exists. It's the last site for the Russians to destroy. And yet it took 8 years. In 2002, the United States committed $20 million, $10 million for each site, to put very high security on both those sites, because they were portable sites. In other words, they had weaponized artillery shells. The other 5 Russian sites are all big bulk barrels and tank trucks and things like that. It would be very hard to steal or disappear. But it took 8 years for anyone, the Russians and the Americans together, to get security. But one of the things that finally dislodged this problem, the Americans just didn't think it was their responsibility to put security on the Russian sites, was 9/11. When 9/11 happened, all of a sudden the light bulb went off and they said, I guess we should put security like Paul Walker and others had recommended in 1994. So by 2002 you had guard towers, higher fences, night lights, troop training, video surveillance, electronic surveillance, guard dogs, you name it, the whole 9 yards. But the Russians since then have done a very good job. 34,500 tons destroyed as of a few weeks ago. And the one point to think of here is the Russians on average have destroyed 2,600 tons a year. The Americans on average have destroyed, you'll see in that slide, 1,000 tons a year. So the Russians started 12 years after the Americans, but in fact, they've destroyed 2.5 times the annual amount of agent. And one of the reasons is most of the Russian stockpile looks like you see in the picture there. Big bulk agent, aerial bombs and spray tanks, and railroad car tanks, in the case of Lewisite. And no explosives, no propellant, rocket propellant or anything. So it's been easier for the Russians, in fact, much easier, much safer, and much cheaper for the Russians to destroy their stockpile. They have about 5 years to go. You know, nobody ever knows in these things. The Russians first said they would finish by 2004. So in essence, they're about 15 years behind, probably. But I'm convinced that they'll get the job done probably a year or two prior to the United States. The other chemical weapon progress, Albania, 2007. Interesting story there very quickly is that Albania, when it joined the convention, I don't know if anyone's mentioned this to you already, but they joined as a non-possessor state in the 1990s, early years. And in 2002 or 2009, it was 2002, they came to the OPSW and said what we call the oops statement. Oops, we think we may have found a chemical weapon stockpile. We're not sure, but would you come and take a look at it and see if you could identify it? So sure enough, there's a little garage up in the mountains outside of Tirana, and the picture of it is on the right. You see there, those are the barrels, small barrels of Albanian chemical weapons. They didn't know it was there. I had no security on the site at all. Apparently, no one had disturbed it. We'll probably never know. I think the Swiss and the Americans and the Germans and others and OPSW officials probably went in and identified it, tested the samples. Sure enough, it was mustard agent. And the mustard agent in these barrels had very clear Chinese markings on the outside. So the barrels had obviously come from China, even though even to this day I think the Albanians don't want to really talk about that at all, nor do the Chinese side. A portable incinerator was designed by Eisenmann Corporation here in Germany, in Europe, and was brought in, set up, and began burning. The only challenge in burning these barrels is no one quite knew how flammable they were, how volatile. And so the first barrel you see there, container, the tank that was burned, it was estimated it would burn for 19 minutes. And in fact, it burned for 19 seconds. It literally exploded in the furnace, burned a hole right through the bottom of the incinerator, burned out the afterburner, which meant you couldn't use the incinerator at all, and almost killed a few workers. So luckily, nobody was in the end killed. Took 6 weeks to find a licensed furnace welder. I didn't know this was such a specialty, but I guess it is. And by that time, Albania had violated the convention, missed its deadline. So Albania was uniquely and totally unintentionally and unpredictably, the first country to really violate the convention. And this came up, I think, interestingly, because we knew that both the Russians and the Americans were going to violate the convention. People don't use what I call the V word, violation, but they missed their deadline, so to speak, in 2012, a few years later. India burned its mustard stockpile. Most people don't know where that was. The Indians don't want to talk about it. There was no public outreach or public participation. I'm told it was right in the middle of a very heavily populated community. So I have no idea what environmental and public health restraints were put on that at all. But that was finished in 2009. I'd urge everyone to urge the Indians to be more transparent about what happened. Libya, the Libyan stockpile is destroyed, 26 tons, which is the total declared stockpile. But the original declared stockpile was only 23 tons under Muammar Gaddafi. And after Gaddafi was killed, the next administration that came in, next government, did another sort of oops, same as Albania, and said, we think we found another stockpile that Gaddafi had apparently hidden. And so they found a weaponized stockpile of artillery shells of mustard agent. That's now been destroyed. But you'll see there it says excluding Schedule 2, there are about 850 tons of precursor chemicals, very similar to what we've taken out of Syria this past year. Iraq has these 2 bunkers. The issue with the bunkers in Iraq is that they're enormous. They're 3 stories high, the size of a soccer field, as I mentioned. They're sealed, and were sealed in the mid-90s by United Nations inspectors. But in fact, are in the area, the Fallujah area, where ISIS has taken over some of the territory. And I'm not sure even today whether ISIS is still there or ISIS is now back out of that area. But there are suspicions that ISIS could have potentially accessed the bunkers and potentially used. Would have been dangerous, would have been almost maybe a kamikaze mission for them, but might have been able to use some of those chemicals. And Syria. So on Syria, very quickly, 1,308 metric tons, only 20, the good news was only 20 metric tons, give or take a ton, was live agent, mustard agent. There was no sarin, actually, found in Syria. But there were plenty of precursor chemicals, you know, the mixture chemicals for sarin. All of that was removed between January and June of 2014. And that was a bit delayed. I mentioned earlier, people complained, you know, there was very high pressure to get the job done quickly and get the chemicals out in the middle of a civil war. But today, you know, the good news is that 98% is destroyed. The Cape Ray operation you see here with the hydrolysis units went very well. There were only some minor incidents. There was a fire in the kitchen of the ship, which potentially could have been really dangerous. That was put out quickly, and there was leakage at one point too. But the leakage was all contained, and in the end, all of this went well. Half the Syrian chemicals were hydrolyzed, neutralized on board the Cape Ray. 154 metric tons burned in Britain at 2 sites. 122 metric tons of isopropanol left back in Syria and neutralized in Syria, so not all of the tonnage was removed actually from Syria. And 500 metric tons treated of lower level chemicals, what the OPSW called Category 2, I think, at one point, or they kept renaming it, confusing us all. Were treated in the United States and Finland, and 6,000 metric tons, which was the neutralized effluent, the toxic effluent, was treated in the United States, Finland, and Germany. But the challenge was there were protests all over the place. Protests all over the place about this. And we argued very strongly, along with a large number of other NGO groups, that there should have been a public dialogue within the Mediterranean. Because you were pulling out 1,300 tons and moving them across the Mediterranean and up around the Atlantic and into the North Sea. And you were doing a very unique operation, a very dangerous operation, basically a big plumbing operation on board the ship. And so we had recommended in writing to the U.S. Secretary of Defense and U.S. Secretary of State that there be a dialogue process in Rome, in Athens, in Istanbul, and in Madrid at least, and probably on Crete and Cyprus as well. And I think the challenge was that all the government officials, including the OPSW, felt that this would take too long, would delay the whole process. The public in the Mediterranean in general will get very upset over all this. So I can talk more about that if you want, but I'm still somewhat critical of the operation, not that it wasn't successful, but in fact that it was too secret and too quick and urgent, not allowing enough time for public sort of democratic decision making around it. I'm going to go quickly through this because I know we have to wrap up and you want to save some time for comments and Q&A too. I'll just mention quickly, cost escalation, big issue. This whole process of destroying, 72,000, 73,000 metric tons of chemical weapons has not been an easy process. I can go on for days and days about this if you want, but one of the biggest issues is it's been really expensive. And I think most of the public has, and a lot of us in the academic community and the activist community have no idea the money being spent on this. So the United States first estimated it would cost $2 billion. This is a very early estimate in the 1980s. It's winding up in the end going to cost well over $40 billion. The early Russian estimates, when we dealt with the Russians in the early 90s, we thought, I remember they said to me, maybe $1.5, $2 billion. I said, no, 3 to 4 at least, maybe more. And in the end, it's going to be well over $10 billion for the Russians. And that doesn't include non-stockpile and sea dump weapons, which I don't think we'll really talk about today much. Technology choice, incineration is very, very controversial, as a lot of you know. The U.S. military in the late 80s and the National Academy of Sciences in the United States said the silver bullet solution is burn it, forget it. You know, build it. Bumper stickers actually said, build it, burn it, forget it. And this was, you know, just really a bad word for most states and state regulators and public health officials and environmental activists and the like. So we got into a whole food fight over the right technology, and that to some extent still goes on today. But in the end, the United States built 5 incinerators and 4 neutralization wet chemistry sites. And in fact, it's worked out in the end, I think, quite well. Emergency preparedness, communities who live around these sites, 9 big stockpiles in the United States, 7 big stockpiles in Russia, have been dealing with these risks and dangers, you know, for decades and decades. And there wasn't going to be much done for the community. You know, the engineers came in and said, we'll spend $1 billion building this site and $1 billion building that site, and you know, everything will go fine, just trust us. And we came in the early to mid-90s and said, we have to have citizen advisory commissions, we've got to talk about all of this publicly. This is difficult because these are all top secret sites. You know, they have a whole history of secrecy around them all. And in the end, I think communities, everyone compromised a bit. Public outreach offices were founded. We did a public outreach. Green Cross did every single Russian site until we were closed down 5 years ago by the Russians and the Global Partnership itself. And in the end, I think shelter in place, evacuation procedures, overpressurization of local school systems, bulletproof glass in school systems actually worked pretty well. Community investment, particularly in Russia, but also to some extent in the United States. These were largely very poor communities, particularly in Russia. The picture on the left there is the main road in Shuchi. There's a local village with 10 to 15,000 people in Siberia. And these communities understandably wanted a piece of the pie. You know, they thought if the Americans in particular are coming in, you know, with $1 billion or more dollars, okay, what do we get out of this? You know, we need water, we need sewage, we need electricity, we need roads, we need local community building, on and on and on. So I just put that picture in to give you a sense of the sort of development or the living situation we're dealing with. And I've been to Shuchi probably 10 or 12 times, I think. And it's better today than it was 20 years ago, but not all that much, frankly. And that was a public hearing, first public hearing we did in Russia, in which we just packed the Dom Kultury, the town halls in these communities. They were very interested and really wanted to know what's in it for me, and what's going to be the risk for my kids and family and the like. That's the town square in Shuchi, in the Kurgan Oblast. We also, you know, had constant demands for transparency, and we're very supportive of that. One of our biases is we really think things should be as transparent and democratic and inclusive as possible. On the left is a protest in Shuchi saying, unless we get community benefits out of this, there's going to be no construction of any of these facilities. And on the right is in Port Arthur, Texas, outside of Houston, Texas, Novi X in Texas, because all of the toxic effluent from the chemical weapons stockpile sites in the United States have been shipped to an industrial waste incinerator in the middle of Port Arthur, Texas, which is a very poor African-American community. So it's brought in all sorts of environmental justice issues to the program as well. So I'm trying to give you the sense these are complicated, very contentious processes. And it puts a lot of us, you know, on the one hand you want to get rid of the stockpiles, you're worried about public health, environmental issues, and proliferation and the like. But on the other hand, you don't want to hurt anybody doing that. You know? That's been echoed at the OPSW in The Hague many, many times, that we're all in favor of arms control, disarmament, abolition of these stockpiles, but not at the expense of anyone in particular. You don't want to kill anybody. You don't even want to increase cancer rates. So, conclusions. Just a few quick conclusions here. Chemical agents are no longer viable military weapons and have become taboo, morally reprehensible, and a dangerous burden. Most of that's, you know, good news, I think. We can abolish a whole weapon of mass destruction. All possessor states must complete safe elimination. Iraq, Libya, Russia, Syria, US, all behind. All non-member states must join the CWC. The 6 countries you see there, Angola, Egypt, Israel, Myanmar, North Korea, and South Sudan. But I also point out, most people won't know this, Palestine is not covered still, and that's a whole political question about whether Palestine, is a country or not, whether they have representation in the United States, and Taiwan, what we call the T word. The other T word from transparency is Taiwan. And whenever you mention the T word, Taiwan, the Chinese ambassador sort of jumps out of his seat. The one China policy, Taiwan is part of China, but Taiwan has one of the biggest chemical industries in the world that needs to be inspected. We have to figure that out. Ongoing use of chlorine, dual-use industrial chemical, and barrel bombs in Syria must stop. That's a whole big issue as well. CWC states parties must fulfill their national obligations under the treaty, including trade reporting has to be done annually. Only 50% of the countries do this. And implementation of a national authority. Protecting the environment, public health, workers' safety, and weapons demilitarization is an absolute necessity. Trumping deadlines and budget limits, and that's been an ongoing fight we've had in all countries over the years. Transparency, stakeholder involvement, public dialogue, and consensus building are essential to program success, even though Syria has gone well without an ideal full-blown outreach program. Abolition of the whole class of weapons of mass destruction, in my mind, of course, is a very historic achievement, very appropriate that we're talking about it today. All parties must support financially and politically the OPCW to continue both stockpile and industrial inspections, prevent the re-emergence of chemical weapons, which is really what we're working on now, besides wrapping up stockpile destruction. And this is very important and really never talked about in the public. It's only us kind of, policy wonks that deal with all the integral policy of the OPCW and its annual budget and everything else that are very concerned about financial cuts in the OPCW and other multilateral organizations. And lastly, the Chemical Weapons Convention is really an excellent model for non-discriminatory, unlike the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and verified abolition, unlike the Biological Weapons Convention, of a whole class of weapons of mass destruction. And congratulations to the OPCW for the Nobel Peace Prize, well deserved. And that's it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. We are up against a little bit of a time problem, but my suggestion is if you have one or two questions specifically on the chemicals aspect, we could take them now while it's in our mind. But if you have points regarding the relationship with nuclear and the broader question of weapons of mass destruction, we take that after the other two speakers. Would that be okay? Would anyone like to come in on the chemicals? Yes, Peter.
You're talking about monitoring stockpiles in the world, particularly in relation to environment, public health. Are old stockpiles, unwanted ones, like the ones we still have in here, and in the north of France, all along the Western Front, are they ever monitored by anyone?
Good question.
Because
so you're
before
talking.
they were being destroyed, now they are getting destroyed. They were getting less and less.
But you're talking mostly about sea dumped and buried.
Exactly.
So you're talking about what we call non-stockpile, or in OPCW and chemical weapons vernacular, it's old and abandoned chemical weapons. No, those. The United States is the one country I'm aware of that has issued a public document listing all the suspected burial sites of chemical weapons since development in World War I. And the biggest site, and really the only major site that's really been dealt with so far, is right in downtown Washington, D.C., where we had a big burial site of chemical weapons from the American University Research Laboratory. And that survey and excavation and very careful destruction of those weapons, and there's been dozens of weapons found in a very completely beautiful upscale neighborhood with multi-million-dollar homes in their backyards and front yards and under their basement and all sorts of things. That's taken 23 years so far, and it's still ongoing. There's been $400 million spent on that one site survey and excavation and cleanup program. There are around 250 other suspected sites in the United States, and the District of Columbia and the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. And we know if that's the case in the United States, certainly the case here in Europe, where obviously a couple of major wars went on, and a lot more weapons were fired, and certainly the case in Russia, and probably China, and India, and Japan. We know it's also the case in Japan. And so most of the dumping and the burial of weapons happened between World War I and World War II. Some of it after World War II as well. But there were obviously no computerized records on any of this. So I know in the case of the United States, they were trying to find people who worked in the 1916, 17, weapons laboratory at American University. Really old timers, I guess we'd say, with shoe boxes full of 3x5 cards in their garages and attics. And they still really never found good documentation of all the trenches and the burial sites. And I think that will probably be the case at other sites too. The American report, I wish all countries would do this. We particularly pressed the Russians to do this, and they haven't. The Russians don't want to talk about burial at dump sites at all. The report just generally lists sites, mostly former military bases, closed military bases. So a lot of work needs to be done on this. But up to now, I think everyone will agree, the real top priority has been on destruction of stockpiles, because people were worried. They were in their backyards, they were leaking. They're worried more and more about terrorism and proliferation. And so the pressure has been on to finish the stockpile destruction, which has been so over budget and so over schedule that, when you mention buried old and abandoned weapons and sea dumped in particular, Baltic Sea and the like, the eyes glaze over all the time. People don't want to talk about this because they really, particularly the Germans, the Italians. Around here, it's mostly German and Italian work, but French and British and American as well. They just don't want to address this yet, and nobody understands the liability of German weapons dumped in the Baltic by Americans from British bases, along the coast of Denmark. And so who actually has liability for this is a big question as well. But it's a big issue, and we know in Spring Valley in Washington, D.C., there were very interesting large clusters of unique cancers that have taken place amongst very highly educated, ambassadors and diplomats and senators and congressmen's families and American university presidents' families that seem pretty unique. And there's been no direct correlation with the chemicals left in the soil and the groundwater. But my guess is it has some relationship with that.
One more. Yeah.
Yes, Pete, just to follow up.
A little bit louder.
Sorry. Just in follow-up to your question, what Paul has been saying, the munitions being recovered from the battlefields of the First World War in France and Belgium, these are taken to specific sites. They actually have to be declared to the OPCW, but they can't. They will be inspected by OPCW inspectors who will determine that they are no longer usable, one, and two, that they were produced before 1925, in which case they're not really chemical weapons anymore, but toxic waste. Because of that, they still have to report destruction rates, but because of that, there are no timelines in terms of destruction. So in Belgium, it has gone at a steady pace until we had the accident with a wrongly identified shell exploding inside the chamber and destroying everything. And yesterday in Brussels, the people from the site said that 60 million euros has now been made available. And next year, by the end of next year, 2016, that installation will become operational again. But in the meantime, they are being stockpiled. To the best of my knowledge, I may be wrong, but I don't think France has actually started destruction of World War I munitions. They're just accumulating them, and one of the huge destruction facilities is under construction, and I think also it should start operations next year.
I think it's maybe 2 years away. But
sorry?
It may be 2 years away from starting.
Well, I mean, they still have 28 years.
Right. But it's a big issue. You can see, and the other stockpile we know of which there's no public information, but I would urge you all to think about this, is the Italians have been digging up weapons, a lot of weapons from the world wars, and sea dump weapons. And I've not been there, but I'm told that it's all being stockpiled at Civitavecchia, just west of Rome. And the Italians are they don't want anyone really to know about this. And to my knowledge, they've really not done any major destruction program yet. So I'm worried about the old and abandoned stuff because it's obviously corroding, leaking, it's killing people, killing fishermen in the Baltic. We had a fishing ship off the New England coast that was badly damaged by old musket weapons that came up in the nets and splashed all the crew just 2 years ago. So these are ongoing issues that will really, be probably for our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren to address, as opposed to all of us in this room.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. You can see what a mine of information he is. And he'll be around for a while for other discussions, I'm sure. So, meantime, please don't start a war because your descendants may have to be picking up the bill. Our next speaker is Lars Perlmeyer from Germany. He's a medical doctor. He's had a long engagement, particularly with the international physicians for the prevention of nuclear war. I think today he's going to be speaking to us mainly on the question of the environmental dimension, nuclear famine and related topics which has not been mentioned here. Another double weapon of mass destruction, you could say. So I think it's going to be very interesting. Lars.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation to Belgium. Being a German was a very moving day for me yesterday. And I'm very grateful, and I think it's wonderful that as a German I can come as a friend and share your mourning for the very terrible things my forefathers committed here in Belgium. I'm a physician, I'm an internist, I work in a big private group practice. We are 4 people, we treat about between 400 and 500 patients every day in peacetime. And I can tell you, I can feel that in case of war, in case of a nuclear attack, I feel when I say there's no way to treat patients in such an incident. So I'm treating many different diseases every day, but in my spare time, my voluntary work, I work on a disease that I could not treat. The only treatment, and I start with a conclusion in a way. We talk about nuclear weapons, the only way is prevention, and the only way for prevention is to abolish nuclear weapons. That's something I will address. Well, I was asked to talk about the impact of nuclear weapons on the city. I think that has been well covered already this morning. And since I successfully destroyed my file with my own PowerPoint presentation, I had to download slides from the internet. I think I will go right into the topic of nuclear famine and climate aspects of the use of nuclear weapons. But before I do that, just to underline what I just said, that to be clear of the dimension, many international organizations made very firm and clear statements with regards to the impact on health from Hiroshima. But if we realize that the nuclear weapons that we have today are a completely different dimension of, have a completely different dimension of destructive power, we can imagine what that would mean. I cannot perceive that Hiroshima helps us to have an idea of what could happen, but I think in case of a real use of nuclear weapons today, the impact would be far broader. So just to make one quote here, the International Committee of the Red Cross already in 1950 called on all states to take all steps, I quote, all steps to reach an agreement on the prohibition of atomic weapons. The prohibition of atomic weapons. Okay, I skipped the first part and go right into the nuclear famine. I think many of the activists who were active when I was a small child in the 80s are familiar with the term nuclear winter. As I understand it, at that time it was not so clear what that would actually mean, and there has been a lot of work on possible climate changes. So IPPNW, my organization, has tried to bring the two aspects together to remind us of the terrible climate impact. This is Ira Halfland, one of our co-presidents who has worked a lot on these topics. He could not attend this conference. So the scenario we are using is a possible regional war. One of the myths that are used, that there was a possibility of keeping nuclear war in a region. And one of the likely or possible examples could be a limited nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan involving maybe only 100 Hiroshima-sized bombs, which is much less than they have in their combined arsenals. Such a war would kill up to 20 million people outright as the great cities of the subcontinent were destroyed. But it would blanket much of South Asia with radioactive fallout. But the global consequences are even more alarming. Peer-reviewed studies by climate experts show clearly that this event, this limited nuclear conflict, would affect weather patterns throughout the world. Soot and debris injected into the atmosphere from the explosions and resulting fires would block sunlight from reaching the Earth, producing an average surface cooling of -1.2 degrees Celsius. That would last over several years. Seems to be little, 1.2 centigrades. But even 10 years out, there would be a persistent average cooling of -0.5 degrees Celsius. How significant would be such a drop in temperature? This slide, prepared at the time this research was done, compares the global warming of the last 120 years with the cooling that would take place in a matter of days. As a result of the cooling, there would be decreases in the growing season, frost-free days on the planet, of 10 to 20 days maybe in many of the most important grain-producing areas throughout the world. This decrease might completely eliminate crops that have insufficient time to reach maturity. There will also be major alterations in patterns of precipitation, with a 10% reduction in global rainfalls and large reductions in the Asian summer monsoon. The most important direct effect of these changes in temperature and precipitation would be a decrease of global food production. While there are no accurate estimates of the shortfall in food production available at this time, there is an historic experience from which we have learned, which is actually 100 years ago. There was the eruption of the Tambora volcano in 1815, where there was a 0.7 degree Celsius drop of temperature, which lasted only for 1 year. But even in North America, the year 1816 was called the year without a summer, with significant frost in July and twice in August, and a widespread loss of crops, with a doubling of grain prices. In densely populated areas elsewhere in the world, in Europe and India as well, there was a significant famine reported. In 1816, yeah, I think I'll skip that. How long? I did not watch it. Okay. Oh, 10 minutes, okay. Yeah, I'll skip that. Oh. The rice production change. Yeah. A recent IPNW study showed that the US corn production would decline by an average of 10% for an entire decade, with the most severe decline about 20% in year 5. There would be a similar decline in soybean production, with again the most severe loss, about 20%. This is the slide we're talking about now. That's the significant decline in Chinese middle season rice production. We assume that during the first 4 years, rice production would decline by an average of 21%. The decline in available food would be exacerbated by increases in food prices, which would make food inaccessible to hundreds of millions of the world's poorest. And now we're leaving the local character again. Even if agricultural markets continue to function normally, 250 million people from the global south would be added to the rolls of the malnourished over the course of a decade. At this point of time, we are ill prepared to deal with a major fall in world food supply. In June 2013, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization estimated that grain stocks were 500 million metric tons, 21% of the annual consumption of 2,400 million metric tons. Expressed as days of consumption, this reserve would last for about 80 days. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization estimated in 2012 that there are already 800 million people in the world who are suffering from malnutrition. Given this precarious situation, even a small further decline in food production could have major consequences. Current grain stocks would not provide any significant reserve in the event of a sharp decline in global production. At the current baseline, there are already millions of people suffering chronic malnutrition. The average adult needs are somewhat between 1,800 and 2,000 calories per day, depending on his or her stature. There are more than 1 billion people in the world whose daily caloric intake falls below these minimum requirements. Each year, some 5 million children in this group starve to death. A further small decline in available foods will put this entire group at risk. A number of factors suggest that accessible food for those who are already malnourished would decline dramatically. Given these conditions, even a modest sudden decline in agricultural production could trigger massive famine. There's an example of the Great Bengal famine in 1943, but I'll leave that out too. China's another. Because I want to draw your attention to another aspect of the problem. First, there's a very high likelihood that famine on this scale would lead to major epidemics of infectious diseases. The famine of 1860, the Tanzora event, triggered an epidemic of typhus in Ireland that spread to much of Europe, and the famine conditions in India that year led to an outbreak of cholera, and that has been impacted in the first global cholera pandemic. Malaria, plague, would be other diseases. Finally, we need to consider that the immense potential for war and civil conflict that would be created by famine on this scale. Within nations where famine is widespread, there would almost certainly be food riots and competition for limited food resources. Armed conflicts seem highly likely as states depend on imports, adopt whatever means at their disposal in an attempt to maintain access to food supplies. In the worst case, this might involve further use of nuclear weapons. It's impossible to accurately estimate the global death toll from disease and further warfare that this limited regional nuclear war might cause. But given the worldwide scope of the climate effects, the death from these causes might well number an additional hundreds of millions. The worst case, which cannot be ruled out, and with the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, the discussion comes up again, although it seems to be solved, the problem of the Cold War, a new Cold War arising. The worst case could be another use of many of the 20,000 nuclear weapons that the two countries, Russia and the United States, possess today. If 500 warheads hit major US and Russian cities, hundreds of millions of people would die in the first half hour, and tens of millions would be fatally injured. we know that. But even this is not the full story. Because of such an attack would cause the same kind of climate disruption as a limited nuclear war, but on a much larger scale, we would probably talk about the end of the world as we know it. So I come to the end, because I can give, of course, there are so many figures around, but the bottom line and the take-home message and the conclusion remains that nuclear weapons are by no means, there's no way to tempted to say responsibly, there's no way for a nuclear weapon to be used in any conflict. It will hit back on all of us. It will, in any case, probably today have global implications, and we must move forward and be clearer than we have been in the past, that it's an absolutely urgent problem to be solved and addressed, and we cannot go on like we did in the past. So I'll take a break now and take questions.
Take a couple of questions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's. Yes, please.
There are a lot of people who have asked a number of basic questions, so maybe I anticipate some thoughts that are in Peter's mind. Over 600 atmospheric tests were made up until first the limited test entry, the comprehensive test entry, and it did not cause nuclear winter. But this is because these tests occurred in places where there was nothing to burn. They occurred in deserts, and they occurred in the oceans, or high up in the atmosphere. And so the only examples we have of what happens when you explode a nuclear weapon in an area with a concentration of flammable materials are Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We saw the image of what everyone calls the nuclear mushroom cloud over Hiroshima in Secretary General Komizo's presentation. But in fact, that's not the mushroom cloud. The mushroom cloud was about a third the size of that cloud. What that shows is the column of smoke rising up from the firestorm that was incinerating the rubble that was left over from the initial nuclear explosion, rising 20 kilometers high into the atmosphere and then flattening out when it hits the boundary between the upper and lower atmosphere. And so that is photographic evidence that firestorms do in fact inject smoke and soot into the upper atmosphere, which is where they can spread and cause the problems that the scientists now have been warning about. The latest scientific studies have taken into account the coupling between the atmospheric temperature changes and the ocean temperature changes. And you may have noticed in one place with the picture of Ira Helfand, they crossed out 1 billion and put in 2 billion. That's because when you couple the oceans to the atmosphere, the ocean cools, and when the temperatures start to rise, the oceans absorb the heat, and the atmosphere and agriculture don't benefit. And it prolongs the cooling impact from 1 decade into 2 decades. And this is just for limited nuclear war. So every time the scientists have looked at this in greater detail, they learn that the climate ecological system is more sensitive and more fragile than they understood it before. And so they've been trying to be very cautious, not to be accused of running around saying the sky is falling. But what they're finding is the sky is falling. And they are gradually gaining the confidence from their models being run in different institutions and different settings that in fact all the findings are pointing to a very serious impact of even a limited nuclear war. And just one last point, the 100 Hiroshimas, those 100 Hiroshimas could easily occur in 20 cities. In other words, 5 areas equivalent of Hiroshima in one larger metropolis. So 20 large nuclear weapons exposed over large metropolises could have all the effect that Lars has been talking about.
I mean, just one, because we're talking about the medical equipment this morning. I left it over. I just wanted to say, in Hiroshima, as the numbers I have, that out of 300 doctors, 270 were reported dead. Out of 1,780 nurses, 1,650 were dead. And from the 140 pharmacists, 112 were dead. 42 out of 45 hospitals were non-functional. And the number that I find interesting, the most complex injuries we would have to deal with as doctors would be the burns, treating the burns. And to give you an example, I think in my city of Bremen with 500,000 inhabitants, for serious burns, we transport the people to Hamburg, the patient to Hamburg, where they have 5 beds specialized for burning injuries. And I have a number from the United States. The United States has about 1,760 hospital beds dedicated to specialized care of burn victims in the whole country. 1,760. 580 of which are typically unoccupied on any day. So that leaves 1,000 for the whole population. That's what we're talking about. All right.
Thank you very much, Lars. It's a very grim picture. I'm hoping that the next speaker will be able to lift our spirits a bit. You know, we've had 70 years with nuclear weapons, a lot more years with chemical weapons. But we've also had 70 years of an international disarmament movement. And that movement still has some strength in it, and is developing all kinds of different expertise and has different sectoral departments or wings. And Alan Ware's been involved in several of those different sectors. He began with the educators, and he moved to working with the lawyers against nuclear arms. And now he's the international coordinator of the Parliamentarians Network, PNND. And he runs the Basel Peace Office, and he's got all kinds of positive ideas and strategies for how we're going to get rid of these damn things.
Thanks, Colin, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak. It's quite special to be here for me from New Zealand. Tomorrow, it's actually Saturday in New Zealand tomorrow, because we're one day ahead. Tomorrow is Anzac Day, which is the day that we pause and have a day off to think about war and the tragedy of war. And we have a special connection between New Zealand and here, the fields of Flanders and Ypres. In fact, a couple of people here have got like these little emblems on their shoulder, you might like to see it, which has got the fern leaf, which is our national symbol, and the poppy. And that connects the two countries, the fern leaf from New Zealand and the poppy from the fields of Flanders. Because it was here that we sent so many young men to fight, to kill and to die in the First World War, and they're buried and the poppies came up sort of on their graves. So it's a very potent symbol for us. In fact, there are a number of commemorations happening over the next couple of days in New Zealand, and people will be wearing the poppies to make that connection with here. So we've got a bit of a connection going. I'm not here to dwell on the past. It's really important to remember the past, and it's really important to learn the lessons from the past to help us to do better in the future. But I will pick up the challenge that Colin has given me, which is to try and give a little bit of a positive angle to this. Some experience of where we've made a difference. New Zealand is one. We used to be a country that was totally in support of nuclear weapons. Virtually everyone in support of nuclear weapons. We were in the Second World War probably going to be one of the next countries to be overrun by Japan. And Japan had already started the attack on Australia. We were going to be next. And when the nuclear weapons were used, we believed the myth that it was the nuclear weapons that ended the war and saved us from being overrun by Japan. We've heard today that that's not true. It wasn't the nuclear weapons, but that was the myth, and that's what we as New Zealanders, I wasn't alive back then, but my parents were, they grew up on that myth, and so there was incredibly strong support for nuclear weapons. We were part of the ANZUS Alliance, Australia, New Zealand, US. We supported nuclear deterrence. We welcomed warships coming into our ports with nuclear weapons. But then we've changed. And it was partly through education, political action, peace movement work, learning about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, learning from the experience of the nuclear tests. And so we shifted that. There was a shift in consciousness in New Zealanders, there was a shift in politics. We prohibited nuclear weapons in the 1980s. At that time it was only about 50-50. Only about just over 50% of the population supported the ban. The others were like scared, are we going to is our security going to be upset by this? Maybe might we be attacked by the Indonesians, a huge country to our north, or maybe a resurgent Japan or the Chinese or the Soviets then, the Russians. But since then we've emerged from that to realise that our security has been enhanced so much by giving up the nuclear weapons and by looking at security in a new framework. Well, not really a new framework, the framework's been around, but putting a lot more emphasis on the cooperative security framework, on international law, on using the United Nations. We'll hear in the next session a little bit more about the United Nations approaches to these issues. In New Zealand, we've had that experience. When serious conflicts have come up, since we abolished nuclear weapons, our thinking has been reshifting also, and we haven't responded to these conflicts nearly as much with thinking about the use of force, but more, is this something that could go to the International Court of Justice? And we've taken a couple of cases there. Or can we use the good offices of the UN Secretary General, which is what we did to resolve the dispute when France blew up our peace boat. So my feeling of optimism on this is not just to do with I think it's possible to change minds and to change the reliance on nuclear weapons, but that also changes the thinking to do with security and helps build a more cooperative security approach that will help with the other conflicts as well. So that's sort of the positive angle. I've been asked to focus on what's coming up pretty soon. That's the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We're going to have governments come into New York for 4 weeks to deliberate about the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Civil society will be there as well. Is that somewhere where some progress can be made on nuclear disarmament? The jury is out on that, of course. If you have a look at previous NPT review conferences, there have been pluses and minuses. There have been some things of them which have been very important and very helpful, and there have been huge disappointments also. I mean, of course, the biggest disappointment is Article 6, which the nuclear weapon states agreed that they would work for the elimination of nuclear weapons, the end of the nuclear arms race and for nuclear disarmament. And